The carriage had been a mistake from the first mile. Lady Molly Marston had known it the moment she'd hired the rickety thing in Carlisle, the wheels uneven, the coachman half-deaf, and the horses thin-legged and nervous as cats. But money was no longer something she could afford to be particular about, and so she had climbed inside, arranged her damp skirts against the cracked leather seat, and told herself that dignity required no audience. That had been 3 hours ago. Now, somewhere deep in the Scottish Highlands, dignity was the least of her concerns. The rain had arrived the way catastrophe always does, without negotiation. One moment the sky was the flat, indifferent gray she had grown accustomed to since crossing the border. The next, it cracked open like a wound, pouring down in sheets so thick she could no longer see the moorland through the carriage window. Thunder rolled across the hills in long, continuous waves, shaking the wooden frame around her. Lightning split the sky in two. The horses screamed. She felt the wheel go before she heard it, a sickening lurch, a crack like a rifle shot beneath the axle, and then the carriage tilted violently to the left and stopped. The coachman's cry came a half-second later, followed by silence, and that silence was somehow worse than everything before it. "Mr. Baird," Molly called, pushing against the door. The angle of the carriage made it heavy and awkward. She forced it open with both hands and stepped out into the storm. The road, if it could still be called that, had become a river. Brown water churned around her boots, climbing toward her ankles with alarming intention. The carriage sat tilted at a broken angle in the ditch, one rear wheel shattered to splinters. Mr. Baird lay groaning against the verge, his arm twisted beneath him, conscious but unable to rise. The horses had gone still, trembling and wild-eyed where they stood tangled in their harness. Molly stood in the downpour and assessed the situation with the cold clarity she had learned to adopt in place of panic. There was no shelter she could see. The road curved behind her into darkness and ahead into worse darkness. The water around her feet was rising, and she was, in every meaningful sense of the word, alone. She was reaching back into the carriage for her bag when she heard the hooves. They came out of the storm from the north, not the frantic clatter of a startled animal, but a deliberate, powerful rhythm that cut through the sound of the rain like a command. A single horse and rider emerged from the gray curtain of weather, moving at a controlled gallop that slowed only when the rider pulled up short at the sight of the wrecked carriage. The man on horseback was enormous. Not merely tall, though he was that, broad through the chest and shoulder in a way that suggested he had been built for exactly this kind of weather, this kind of terrain, this kind of moment. He wore no hat. His dark hair was soaked flat against his forehead. A heavy riding coat hung from his frame, and beneath it she caught the dark wool of Highland dress. His horse, a black beast that seemed equally unbothered by the storm, stamped once and went still beneath him. He looked at the carriage. He looked at the coachman. Then he looked at her. His eyes were gray, the precise shade of the sky before the storm had broken and just as unreadable. "Are you hurt?" His voice was deep, carrying the low, rolling cadence of the Highlands, not a question so much as an assessment. "I am not," Molly said, lifting her chin against the rain. "My coachman is, his arm, I believe." The man dismounted in a single fluid movement, handed his reins around the carriage post without looking, and crossed to Mr. Baird in 4 strides. He crouched, examined the arm with practiced hands, and stood, not broken, dislocated. He said it the way other men said good morning. "He'll need setting, not here." "No," Molly agreed, "not here." He turned to look at her again, and there was something in that look not unkind but penetrating, as though he were calculating something she wasn't privy to. "Dunmore Castle is 2 miles north. You'll come there." It was not phrased as an invitation. Molly straightened. Water ran in rivulets from the brim of her bonnet and down the back of her neck. "I don't believe I caught your name, sir." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. "Ronan Callum Mac Alistair, Duke of Strathmore." He said it without ceremony, the way a mountain might announce itself, simply by being there. "And you are standing in a flooding road in my county, so I suggest we continue this introduction somewhere dry." She had heard the name, Everyone who moved in any circle connected to the Scottish nobility had heard the name. The Duke of Strathmore, reclusive, formidable, unmarried by obstinate choice, and entirely indifferent to what anyone thought of any of those qualities. Lady Molly Marston, she said, matching his tone precisely. Of Marston Hall, Westmoreland. He nodded once, as though filing the information away, then moved to assist Mr. Baird to his feet. He half carried the older man to his horse with an ease that suggested the effort cost him nothing. Then he returned to her, standing close enough that she caught the scent of rain and wood smoke beneath the storm. "Can you ride behind me, Lady Marston, or would you prefer I arrange for you to stand here and make a point of it?" Molly looked at the flooded road. She looked at the broken carriage. She looked at him. "I can ride," she said. And so the storm carried them both north, toward Dunore Castle, toward firelight and dry stone walls, toward a dinner neither of them had anticipated, and toward something neither of them yet had the language to name. Dawn at Dunore Castle arrived without apology. Light pressed through the narrow stone windows in long, pale fingers, reaching across the guest chamber where Molly had slept deeply, against her intentions, in a bed that was older than her grandmother and more comfortable than anything Marston Hall had offered in the last 4 years. She lay still for a moment, listening. The storm had gone. In its place was the particular silence of the Highlands after rain, vast and clean and indifferent to human complication. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair without a maid, and told herself she would be on the road within the hour. The road, as it turned out, had other ideas. The housemaid who brought her breakfast delivered the news without drama. The lower pass remained flooded, the northern track had washed out entirely, and the replacement wheel for the carriage would not arrive from the village until late afternoon, if the cart could get through at all. Molly received this information with a composed nod, waited until the girl left, and then stood at the window for a long moment watching the gray-green moors stretch endlessly below her. One more day. She could endure one more day. She found the library by accident. She had been following a corridor she believed led back toward the main hall when a half-open door revealed a room that stopped her entirely. Floor to ceiling, every wall consumed by books, not decorative volumes arranged for appearance, but read books, creased and annotated and clearly loved. Maps were pinned across one table. A worn leather chair sat beside the fireplace with a book left open across its arm, face down, as though its owner had stepped away only moments before. She stepped inside. She could not help it. She was reading the spine of a collection of Highland poetry when she heard him. "That one," said the Duke from the doorway, his voice carrying the same low authority it had possessed in the middle of a rainstorm, "was my mother's." Molly did not startle. She turned calmly, the book still in her hand. He was dressed plainly for a duke, dark wool, no adornment, and he looked in the morning light exactly as he had looked in the storm, immovable, watchful, slightly inconvenient. She had excellent taste, Molly said. She had extraordinary taste. He crossed to the fireplace and stood with his back to it, arms folded. "In most things." There was a pause that lasted precisely long enough to become something. "The road is still impassable," he said. "So I was informed. You'll stay another day." "It appears so." He studied her the way he seemed to study everything, directly, without the performative disinterest that most men of his rank deployed around women they didn't know what to do with. It was unsettling. Molly had spent a lifetime being looked past, or looked through, or looked at in the particular way that reduced a woman to her prospects and her face. The Duke of Strathmore looked at her as though she were a problem he found genuinely interesting. "You're traveling to Edinburgh," he said. "To the Baron Fenmore." "Yes." "You don't want to?" It was not a question. Molly felt something tighten in her chest, not at his perception, but at how easily he had said what she had spent months refusing to say to herself. "What I want," she replied carefully, "is not presently the governing factor." "No," he said, "duty is. I'm familiar with the condition." Something in his tone opened a door she hadn't expected. She looked at him more directly. "The Crown's mandate," she said. You're to take a duchess before the royal assembly." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The king believes that a Highland duke without a wife is a Highland duke without an anchor. He prefers his nobility anchored. "And yet you've resisted." "I've ignored it," he corrected, "which is different. Resistance implies the thing deserves engagement." Despite herself, she almost smiled. "The assembly is in 4 days." "3," he said. "Which brings me to something I wish to say to you directly, Lady Marston, and I'll ask you to hear it fully before you respond." Molly set the book of poetry carefully back on its shelf and turned to face him properly. "Very well." Ronan Mac Alistair unfolded his arms and looked at her with those unreadable gray eyes, and what he said next rearranged the architecture of her morning entirely. "Marry me instead." The fire crackled. Outside, a bird called once across the wet moors and went quiet. "It is a practical arrangement," he continued before she could speak. "You leave behind a man you fear and a match that serves only your family's debt. I fulfill the crown's requirement without surrendering my household to someone chosen by committee. You receive the title, the protection, and the financial security to settle your family's obligations outright. I receive a duchess in time for the assembly." He paused. "It is logical." "It is arrogant," Molly said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." She stared at him. He stared back. The audacity of him was breathtaking, and beneath her fury she was aware with uncomfortable clarity that her mind was already turning the proposal over, examining it from every angle the way one examines a door one claims not to want to open. "I am not a transaction," she said. "No," he agreed with surprising immediacy. "You are not, which is precisely why I'm asking rather than arranging." Before she could answer, boots sounded in the corridor outside. His steward appeared in the doorway, grim-faced. "Your Grace, Baron Fenmore's men are at the gate, 4 riders. They say the lady is expected and they've come to collect her." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ronan turned toward the door with a stillness that was somehow more dangerous than movement. "Tell them," he said quietly, "that Lady Marston is under the protection of the Duke of Strathmore, and that they are welcome to leave the same way they arrived." He turned back to Molly. Something had shifted in the room, the air itself felt different. She lifted her chin. "If I agree," she said slowly, "I will not be owned. I will have autonomy within this marriage. I will be treated as an equal in this house, or I will leave it, duke or not." Ronan looked at her for a long moment, the longest he had looked at her yet. Then he nodded, once, slowly. "Deal," he said. By noon, they were riding south toward Edinburgh, 2 strangers bound by a storm and a single spoken word, the golden highlands rolling wide and open around them, neither willing to name the thing that rode quietly between them like a third traveler. Edinburgh did not whisper. It roared. By the time Ronan and Molly rode through the city gates, the rumor had already outpaced them. The reclusive Duke of Strathmore, the man who had ignored 3 royal summons regarding matrimony, who had attended the last assembly alone and left before the second toast, had arrived with a woman at his side. The gossip moved through the drawing rooms and anterooms of the royal court like fire through dry summer grass, consuming everything in its path and leaving nothing unchanged. Molly felt it the moment they entered the reception hall of Holyrood Palace. Eyes found her the way blades find gaps in armor, precise, probing, looking for weakness. Ladies behind painted fans. Lords who assessed her the way they assessed horseflesh. She kept her spine straight, her chin level, and her expression pleasantly, devastatingly neutral. She had survived the collapse of her family's fortune, 4 seasons of London society, and a Highland rainstorm. She would survive Edinburgh. Ronan walked beside her and said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence alone was its own declaration. They were given adjoining chambers and 1 evening to breathe before the assembly convened. Molly used the hours to dress with careful deliberateness, deep green silk, her mother's pearl earrings, her hair arranged with a severity that said she had not come to be decorative. When she looked in the mirror, she saw something she hadn't seen in months looking back at her. A woman who had made a choice. The Grand Hall of Holyrood was magnificent in the way that power always made things magnificent, excessively, intentionally, designed to make ordinary people feel small. Candlelight poured from chandeliers above a floor crowded with Scotland and England's finest, all assembled before the elevated throne, where King George IV sat with the patient authority of a man accustomed to being the most important person in every room he entered. Molly entered on Ronan's arm. She heard the shift in the room before she saw its cause. Baron Aldrich Fenmore stood near the left colonnade, flanked by two associates, his face carrying the particular red-cheeked fury of a man who had been publicly inconvenienced and had decided to make it everyone else's problem. He was older than she remembered, heavier, small-eyed, with the kind of mouth that smiled only when something was being taken from someone. He had ridden hard from the south to be here, and the effort had not improved his temperament. Their eyes met across the hall. His narrowed. Hers didn't move at all. The assembly proceeded through its formalities with the grinding ceremony that such occasions demanded: oaths renewed, titles confirmed, regional matters addressed before the crown. Molly stood composed beside Ronan through all of it, feeling the room's attention like a second skin she'd been sewn into. Then Fenmore moved. He stepped forward into the floor's open center with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed this moment. He addressed the king directly, his voice pitched to carry. "Your Majesty," he said, with a bow that was technically correct and spiritually contemptuous, "I come before this assembly to protest a grave injustice. Lady Molly Marston was promised to me by formal arrangement. She was intercepted during her journey north by the Duke of Strathmore and held at his estate under circumstances I call deeply irregular. He let that land. I ask the Crown to recognize my prior claim and restore what was wrongfully taken." The hall was absolutely silent. King George turned his gaze, heavy, evaluating, toward Ronan. Ronan stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He simply moved to the center of that vast, candle-lit hall with the unhurried certainty of a man who had decided something and was now simply informing the world of it. "Your Majesty," he said with a bow of genuine respect, "the Baron's account is creative. Lady Marston was not intercepted. She was stranded alone in a flooding road in a Highland storm, and I brought her to safety, as any man with a shred of honor would do." His voice remained level, but it filled every corner of the room. What happened after was not manipulation. It was a conversation between two people who chose freely. Fenmore's mouth opened. Ronan continued, "I stand before this assembly and before my king to name Lady Molly Marston as my chosen Duchess of Strathmore." He paused, and when he continued, the words came differently, stripped of politics, stripped of strategy, carrying the unguarded weight of something true. "Not because the crown required it of me, not because of arrangement or advantage, but because she is the only woman I have ever encountered who stood before me without performance, without fear, and without the faintest inclination to pretend she was anything less than exactly what she is." His gray eyes moved across the room and found her. "That is not something a man encounters twice. I did not intend to let it pass." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes something irreversible. King George leaned forward slightly. His gaze moved past Ronan, past Fenmore, and settled on Molly with a directness she hadn't anticipated. "Lady Marston," the king said, "this assembly and this crown recognize that you are a free-born Englishwoman. What is your will?" Every candle in the hall seemed to hold its breath. Every eye followed. Fenmore's expression had curdled into something desperate. Ronan stood utterly still, and she understood in that moment that he would not move, would not signal, would not ask anything more of her than he already had. Whatever she said, he would accept it. That stillness cost him something. She could see it. Molly Marston looked at the Baron, at the life she had been quietly drowning toward for months, and she looked at the king. And then she looked at Ronan MacAllister standing alone in the center of that magnificent room, armored in nothing but honesty. She lifted her chin. "I choose the Duke," she said, her voice clear and unhesitating across every inch of that grand hall. "Not because he saved me from a storm, but because he is the first man who looked at me and saw someone worth asking." The room broke open. Fenmore's fury erupted in a torrent of accusations so excessive, so revealing of his true character, that the king silenced him with a single raised hand and dismissed him from the assembly in 3 quiet words. His humiliation was complete, absolute, and entirely his own making. That evening, as Edinburgh's lanterns trembled gold across the ancient city below, Ronan and Molly stood together on a stone balcony above the palace gardens. The storm was a memory. The court was behind them. The silence between them was the comfortable, breathing kind, the silence of 2 people who have stopped pretending. "Did you mean it?" he asked quietly, just that. The armor entirely gone. Molly looked at him, this enormous, impossible, unexpectedly tender man who had ridden out of a rainstorm and rearranged everything. "The arrangement we made at Dunore," she said, "is already obsolete." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand slowly, carefully, as though she were something worth being careful with. She let him. Below them, the city burned quietly with light. Above them, the sky was the deep, clear black that only comes after a storm has finally, completely passed. The Duke had saved her from the storm, but she had saved him from something far worse, a life where no one was brave enough to stay.